The Director General of the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. Please may I ask all our panelists to make their way to the stage. It's over to you, Doctor.
Good afternoon. I'm hoping that everybody has enjoyed the lunch. I am Dr. Stella Khumalo, the Deputy Director General in the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. Myself and my co-chair, Flavia, would be chairing this session. I'm inviting those that haven't settled down to please do so. But we are going to go on with our program as indicated. The session that we are going into deals with issues of trends, tensions, and other global perspectives of the creative economy. So, without any further waste of time, I want to call upon Dr. Hubert Eskyth, who's waiting for us. He is going to address us and talk to us and indicate to us how we can go towards a new globalized creative economy. Hubert is a former chief statistician, World Trade Organization, and an UNTAD consultant. Hubert, you are welcome. Over to you. We are waiting to hear from you through your address. Over to you, Hubert.
Thank you very much. Try to start. Okay, I hope you hear me and you see me. I would like to thank you and the organizer for the kind invitation to this Saco conference. It's a great honor being invited, especially speaking the same panel as two internationally recognized intellectuals. I'm not an intellectual, and I'm not recognized. I want also to thank UNCTAD for inviting me to write the report I will present right now. I just want to say that the opinions are mine and do not reflect UNCTAD's position. I'm speaking from Valencia in Spain, and I'll try to make it as short as possible to give time to my co-panelist. And it starts. Okay. And do you see? I suppose you see the slide. This is a content of the report. But before starting, I would like to have a preliminary remark. As we used to say when I was young and a Marxist, I'm no more, you have to say, where are you speaking from? My interest and perspective in this subject of creative economy started in the late 1990s when I worked with small Central American and Caribbean countries with the objective of increase the value added of their exports and differentiate them from generic low-cost products.
Sorry to interrupt you, Prof.
Can we be assisted? Can somebody check for us? We seem to apologize for that, colleague.
Yeah. This is your problem. You're inviting old people to speak, you know? Let me see. Share screen, okay? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And no. And now you tell me. Is it okay? Do you see it?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. So I said, well, everything started in the Caribbean, trying to increase the value added of exports, non-traditional exports, traditional exports. After that, I moved to a topic at the World Trade Organization on global value chain, and I became very much interested in the role of intangibles in determining value added in industrial processes. And when I refer to industrial processes, I include also individual small firms' production. As a statistician by training, I was also interested in the challenge of measuring all that. And finally, after working more than 35 years in development economics, I was very much interested in the potential of Industry 4.0, as it is known, first as being a disruptive change. So it may threaten the means of existence of many creative workers. But I was also interested in the potential of Industry 4.0 to change advanced technology into what we used to refer in the 70s as appropriate technology, for rural development, etc. So then it's basically the interest of in this topic. I will speak, in the report there's a lot of data on the economic weight. Those are mainly numbers you will find in the literature. Those are misleading. So don't believe me, or don't believe them, or take them with a pinch of salt. Because, as I mentioned in the report, and it has been already mentioned in this morning, there's a lot of non-market value in the creative economy. Heritage, culture are public goods. They are not measured in market transaction. The qualitative dimension of the creative economy is probably more important than the quantitative one, even from an economic perspective. Because we have what we mention as spillovers. Spillovers are dramatically difficult to measure, and this is the statistician speaking. You have knowledge spillovers, so one you discover in industry may be used by another one. The product spillovers, when some designers in 3D invent new games, people in the electronic industry have to create the electronics needed for that. The network spillovers, and when you have many creative workers being together, you have what's called agglomeration economy, and you have many articles in the academia on the so-called creative city. You have training spillovers. When you train people in one industry, they can move to another one, and when they are trained in using advanced technologies and creative methods, my own interest, because I work in rural development during many years, it's the bottom of the pyramid. Many handicraft people in developing countries are informal workers. Those people are not counted. They are not counted. And even if they are counted, their contribution to GDP is minor. Nevertheless, if you are able to increase their daily income by $1, for them it makes a lot of difference, even if for the GDP it doesn't make a lot of difference. So, as I said, the report presents those data. It's important to have them, but it's not really important from a conceptual perspective. From a conceptual perspective, I think that many of the papers I reviewed miss something important, is the role of demand in this thing. Demand for creative goods, first, it's sizable, it's a lot of money, but more importantly, from an economic perspective, those are called superior goods. Demand for this type of products, and when I say products, it's goods and services, they tend to increase with income. So the richer you are, or the less poor you are, whatever you want, the more money, the more appetite you have in this type of things. On top of that, and at the difference of other goods like a refrigerator, a car, or something like that, buying one is not just satisfying your demand, because once you start being interested in cultural products, going to theater, even if you're rich enough, buying paintings, you grow your appetite. Here is called the collector type. So it's, in the end, the creative economy is quite a promising sector from an economic perspective. On top of that, there are key drivers in the fringe of the economy, you know, the fashion e-commerce market, the digital part, but the 21st century type of economy. What are the drivers of change? Here I'm referring to a discussion that some of our English colleagues had. I'm sorry, I will refer to market. I'm an economist. The market is important because market is the place where supply, what creative workers have to offer, will meet demand. So I think it's important to refer to market. I mentioned that we can expect a sustained demand for creative product because we have a growing global middle class in developing countries, perhaps not all developing countries, but what's called emerging countries, and more people are interested in what's called creative goods, and it's interesting. I mean, I won't spend time on that, but in many developing countries, the bourgeoisie who used to look down at traditional products now are becoming more and more interested in their own culture. It's a change in the mindset. They are becoming global consumers. The interesting thing is we have in the industry disrupting technologies. They are called Industry 4.0. It's basically linked to electronics, artificial intelligence, internet, 5G, etc., etc. I'm interested in that for two reasons. First, because, in my opinion, not only it will speed up the transfer of technology from advanced countries to less developed countries, but, and to refer to Ernst Schumacher discussion in the 50s and in the 70s on appropriate technology, the elder within us may remember this book of the 70s of Small is Beautiful. Before, and for Schumacher, there were a break, a gap between new technology and the need of the regular and the small people. I hope, I mean, it's still a project of research, that Industry 4.0 will decrease the cost of new technologies and may offer the possibility of transferring this technology as a small-scale equipment for rural development or handicrafters, etc. The second part is more linked to market and demand, is there are new niche market. When you start selling on internet, you are reaching new consumers. In the paper, I hope you read, there is some discussion on what we call the long tail marketing. You know, you're a small scale producer, you have only a few opportunities by country. If you sell only in your neighborhood, you won't be able to make money out of it. If you're able to sell globally, what's called the long tail, you kill the distance issue and you kill the small market limitation. And electronics and the new marketing electronical platform help you to sell in the long tail. Who benefit from that? it would be wrong to think that the benefits of Industry 4.0 is for the digitally creative industry, you know, games, etc. It's relevant for a lot of activities. In the paper, you will see example on movies, architects, musicians who have been already early adopters. I mean, Hollywood is perhaps one of the main consumers of advanced technology. But art dealers, fashion designers, for example, during the COVID-19, some African fashion designer, I guess, remember is Annie Fay, she's from Congola. She had a virtual fashion show with virtual mannequins just because she could not present it in the regular way. Also, well, I already mentioned on the cheaper tools for micro-producer, you can use blockchain in order to certify the authenticity and traceability of your goods, which is very important for artists, but also for handicrafters. Top of that, the digitalized platforms, like, I won't mention Amazon, but everybody speaks about Amazon. They have also additional tools to help producers to do their accounting, to prepare their website, etc. So there are some kind of universe. Obviously, on the benefits, you have the global consumer, but I won't mention a lot of that. But for me, I'm one of the people benefiting from that. And for example, I'm able to speak to you thanks to that. So this is the potential. Obviously, we cannot think only in terms of positive things. I'm a statistician by training, so I'm pessimistic. There are many issues. Well, we know the market power of the platforms I mentioned, but I will say that we should not overestimate the issues. Some people, and I will close on that, say, oh, well, you know, the digital platforms, they take 30% of your benefits, of your cost. Okay, when I was young and working in the field, the middlemen, they used to take 100% markup. So, I mean, we have to compare what's comparable. And this is my concluding slide. And thank you for your patience. The benefits of Industry 4.0 for the creative workers, especially, and this is my main interest, the handicrafter, the people in the rural area, the people, let's say, micro workers. Those benefits remain conditional to what the public policy can do for them. And, well, it was mentioned in the morning, so I won't repeat it, that first, it's part of an ecosystem, I mean, of education, fiscal incentive, financial arms. I mean, you need money to develop your business, and when you're a small producer, in creative sector, it means that you don't have an history of success. It's very difficult to get it. The competition regime, for the government, it's very difficult to design programs because you don't know exactly who is a creative worker. I mean, the discussion about the definition is important on that. If you don't identify who, what, how can you monitor the effectiveness of your policy? For developing countries and least developed countries in particular, the big issue is to close the digital divide. And lots of paper have been written on that. I will just conclude on one thing. In my opinion, for having worked in rural area, I think there is a close correlation between what we see now in creative economy 4.0 for handicrafters and poor people, let's say marginal people, and what we could see in agricultural development in the 70s. We need not only the input, not only the infrastructure, we need an important program. They were called agricultural extensions in the 60s and 70s. They must be called Creative Economy 4.4, not only to bring the techniques to the people, but to teach them or to use them and to organize them in order to benefit from them. And with that, Madam Chair, I finished. I suppose, I hope I have spoken in the limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Hubert Eskyth addressing us and talking to us about what he deems to be the key drivers of change. Towards the end of this three presentations, my co-chair would do a quick summation of the three presentations. Dr. Hubert will stay online for the question and answer session later on. So moving right along, we are now moving on to Professor Homi Bhabha, who is a professor of humanities at the Harvard University. He talks to us about the need to rethink citizenship and affiliations, talking about what he refers to as culture wars, trends driving the state of global culture. Welcome, Professor Bhabha. Over to you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can. We can hear you, Professor Bhabha.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to address you this morning. I immediately see that Dr. Eskyth's presentation is much more relevant to the issues at hand than mine, but I'm still nonetheless very grateful to Amy Shelver and Saco for inviting me to give this talk. It's an honor and a pleasure, although how useful it's going to be, you will have to judge. I'm a professor of literature and culture, and it's a very different tone, but I just hope that it's useful to you. I'm assuming you can hear and see me at this point, because I'm, of course, driving blind here. Is everything okay?
Very much okay, Professor Bhabha.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. So let me start my lecture. I was asked to give a philosophical and cultural reflection on the times in which we are, what we can do, and how the agency of culture and cultural workers might be able to resist or indeed engage with the neoliberal and ethno-nationalist, in particular, forces of governance that are seeding divisions and polarities in this much divided world. Let me then start by giving you the good news that might have reached you, at least good news for me, that the Republican wave that was supposed to crash and thrash against Congress has become something of a stream, not a wave. So I would love to have my South African friends and colleagues applaud this situation in the United States. Let me start with a writer and a thinker who has very much inspired me over the pandemic and on whose work I am writing at the moment, James Baldwin. Baldwin writes that my whole effort, he says, is to try to bear witness to something which will have to be there when the storm is over to help us get through the next storm. We are rarely prepared, I suggest to you, my friends, for our own times. My opening sentence has the feel of a cliche. It sounds like a truism that carries little truth, a pious sentiment undone by its own sentimentality. To be prepared for our own times is a commonplace phrase repeated in melancholic moments, in the afterlife of despair and defeat, in the vain search for consolation, or for the impossible 2020 vision. The tone of the phrase comes not from a sense of a failed past. When we ask ourselves this question, when we feel that we are unprepared for our times, for our present, I don't think we talk about failure, but we talk about an anxiety associated with the anticipation of something happening again in the future. So I think our concern is about an anticipation of the repetition of what it means not to understand where you are, what is happening to you. This untimeliness of human self-awareness fails in the face of historical happenstance. Should I not have known better? Should we not have been warned more fully? Why were we so unprepared for something that lay in waiting for us, stealthily shared our days and nights, and kept its head down while we raised ours in songs of freedom? Bob Dylan's civil rights anthem, his song The Chimes of Freedom, catches the tempo of the moment I'm trying to describe. When Dylan sings of the moment when, as he puts it, the seeming chimes of freedom flashing turn into the thunderbolts, tolling history's death knell, he provides the perfect introduction to my lecture this afternoon. And let me cite one verse from this great anthem for civil rights and this great anthem for the fact that we are often unprepared for the missions and the projects that befall us. Far between sundown's finish and midnight's broken toll, we ducked inside the doorway. Thunder went crashing as majestic bells of bolts struck in the sounds, seeming to be the chimes of freedom flashing. Flashing for the warriors whose strength is not to fight, flashing for the refugees on the unarmed road of flight, and for each and every underdog soldier in the night, and we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. The chimes of freedom start pealing suddenly when we are unprepared for them, flashing on and off like the Morse code of precarious life and sudden death. Ukrainian civilians take up arms in spite of the fact that, in Dylan's words, their strength is not to fight. Refugees, unarmed and unprotected, hear the halting chimes of freedom and know that they have to take flight now, unprepared in the middle of the night. Of late, history has frequently caught us short, and we have been unprepared for our presence. We were unprepared for COVID, of which the historian of science, Lauren Daston, has said, it catapults us back to the 17th century, living in a moment of ground zero empiricism in which almost everything is up for grabs. We were unprepared for the 8.45 to 9 minutes that it took for a police officer to kill George Floyd on a street corner in Minneapolis. And we were equally unprepared for the approximately 20 million multi-ethnic protesters who claimed liberty and security for Black lives on American streets in the very middle of the pandemic, within a month of George Floyd's killing. Now, we are often unprepared for things we know will happen. That's the paradox of this problem that I'm trying to put before you. Pandemics have a long collective and personal history of loss. Criminal injustice has a long history of racial violence in the United States. However, the suddenness of the moment of the emergence of these things, whether it's pandemic or process, demands, I believe, our political and ethical attention. That form of suddenness, something happening suddenly, for which even defies the systemic analyses. It adds something to it. And I think that moment of suddenness is extremely important. What role do the creative industries play in a world struggling to emerge from these shadows of death, shadows of morbidity and mortality, that bring with them shadows of injustice and indignity that have been with us for generations? Too often, to take a long view of history diminishes the urgency of the sudden moment of cultural creativity, political agency, and at the same time, melancholy. We pass the baton of change from generation to generation with a wish and a prayer. However, often little happens and much is lost. The emergency that the pandemic imposed, its suddenness and unpreparedness, startled our present moment in history. The pandemic emptied streets, classrooms and theaters lay fallow, homes were locked down to become safe spaces and prisons all at once. At the same time, the governance of the pandemic pushed some citizens and residents, minority populations, essential workers, first responders, into a precarious public world of unforeseen dangers at a time when they could least afford the burden of debt, disease, and death. The suddenness of time, the unpreparedness of experience, is not simply a reflection of our lives. These measures of time, which we don't always deal with, although we are confronted by risk, but not at this global scale, these measures of time, of suddenness, are like mirrors whose vanishing points are so close to our eyes that what seems like a distortion is actually a portrait of the world that we have built. Being unprepared for the sudden trauma of the moment might provide inflection points that transform, for instance, the relationship between the core creative industries and the adjacent creative economies. An excellent essay, The Creative Economy in Africa and the Diaspora, prepared by Brooks, Moyo, Tapscott, and Shelver on behalf of the South African Cultural Observatory, speaks, I believe, to my point. They write, and I quote them, "A neat categorization is that the creative industries produce work that can be protected by copyright, and the cultural industries produce symbolic meaning. The creative industries use some of what the core producers create to develop marketable products and services. Their outputs are not necessarily symbolically meaningful, but they do generate intellectual property. Arguments for their support are thus around job creation and economic growth potential." And that's from this excellent report and essay. Now, unlike Professor Escate, I'm an uneducated novice in this area, but I want to try out a humanistic argument that both accepts the fine distinction between creative industries and cultural industries, and then suggests a fairly new relation between them, occasioned by what I'm calling the pandemic pause. As the public world shuts down, like the lights going dimmer and dimmer in a theater, we are suddenly made aware of the symbolic meaning of the creative industries. I'm putting it the other way around. So the creative industries now, I believe, develop a symbolic presence in our lives. Job creation dips disastrously, growth potential teeters dangerously, and as the public world retreats into the private home, for those indeed who have such safe spaces, creative industry and cultural industry, privacy and publicity develop a startling proximity. They blur. The concept of the home, mine and yours, becomes wired in a new way. We are both inside the domestic space and in the public space at the same time, more dramatically than ever before. Externalities become internalities or interiorities, and vice versa. Families are experiencing the social world of citizenship with all its responsibilities and precautions within the domestic space as the world becomes the home. Intellectual property and symbolic properties turn into hybrid interstitial realities. We find ourselves on the threshold between the public and the private, in a space of sudden transitions. We attempt to find our bearings on the ethical and existential borderlines between security and risk, sovereignty and solidarity, identity and difference. None of these items can be polarized as distinct entities, because our challenge in this transitional threshold space is to think in the in-between the plurality of persons and the diversity of interests. This is what I have called elsewhere the third space, something that happens suddenly, that relates to what had happened before, but sets up a demand for a different kind of theorization, which will not be satisfied by binary or polarities in the argument or analysis. Now, speaking from this in-between space, from this threshold moment, which I believe the pandemic was, I have to confess, I am not an identitarian. This is why I look for the intertwined, in-between tangled spaces. This doesn't mean that I think that identity issues are unimportant. They are. But instead of talking about political identities, I'm much more interested in political interests. When we move from identity to interest, we begin to see the diverse life choices of different groups fitting together in complex conditions as a collective condition of coexistence, not of necessary identity. These moments that come together, that converge, are like mosaics. The pieces of a mosaic fit together, not because they resemble each other, but because they complement or converge with each other, to borrow an idea from my great mentor, Walter Benjamin. Once we think in terms of interests, my friends, once we think in terms of the powers of recognition and representation based on equality in dignity, not necessarily identity, we can discern many more networks of affiliation, as well as joint fronts of resistance and opposition. When we see the intercultural, multiracial world as a mosaic of social identifications and interests, not discrete identities, rather than a portrait gallery of group identities, we claim rights and responsibility as an interconnected comity of peoples. I am committed to the redistributions of power, not the reinvention of authenticity. Globalization, driven by the priorities of financial markets and political majoritarianism, deploys new technologies to encompass those parts of the world that gravitate toward power and privilege, be it in the global north or the global south. Outside these enclaves of privilege lie those countries and peoples that cannot afford to compete for globalization's glittering prizes. And referring to something that Professor Eskait provoked, the issue now is that within one landmass, within one nation, within one territorial sovereignty, you have a moment of global progress networked to other places of progress, and next door, neighboring, are places that have not shifted statistically or existentially from their poverty and neglect for generations. Where once the idea, if you still remember it, the inspiring ideal of the third world, which was itself deconstructed, but when we held on to the idea, the third world was a challenging call to fight global inequality and injustice, a call to solidarity in the cause of planetary transformation and redistributions in the balance of power. Today, there is a callous contempt for what one ex-president of the United States called shithole countries, and a peremptory dismissal of what in globalization discourse is known as failed states. I mean, let us be clear about this. Many of the so-called failed states have been made to fail by the very powerful, glittering prize recipients of globalization who have made them fail. That doesn't mean that they're innocent. Their leaders are not. But failure, this notion of failed states, rather than in the earlier third world discourse, the notion of empathy, of encouraging development and progress, is something very startling to me. I think globalization has largely created this appalling concept of the failed states, because failed states are people who are places where people who live are not failures. In Globalization and Its Discontents, Joseph Stiglitz warns us of the ravaging effects of free market fundamentalism, as he puts it, which a decade and a half later has brought in its wake a rash of related fundamentalisms that fester on the global body politic. Religious fundamentalism, populist fundamentalism, and xenophobic racial fundamentalism. In such a world, the speed of neoliberal capitalist exploitation and expansion generates a narrative of progress invested in networked oases of accumulation and disruptive innovation, to use the business school jargon, that treat the rest of the world largely as a global wasteland. The endemic and recurrent problems of global justice, global health, global climate change, and global migration often slip through these network chains of neoliberal command. These problems are looked upon with a slight disdain as anachronistic works in progress left over from another time, places and peoples, communities that have not caught up with the speed of globalization as they should have. The ethno-populist systems of power of our global moment impose, I would go on to say, carceral histories and geographies on much of the world order today. Minorities barred from citizenship, refugees barred from borders, public speech barred from the right to opinion, dissidents barred from public demonstrations, protesters barred from the park or the Maidan, black lives barred from protection. The prison house of the present, and perhaps I'm being more melancholic than I should be, but I think melancholia for democracy is more healthy than mourning democracy at a later time. So the prison house of the present, which exists in more places than we care to name, is an attempt to build walls of exclusion and interdiction where there should be a free and equal passage across the thresholds of public life. Let me just say something very basic here, which I believe in deeply. Hannah Arendt has written, I think rather beautifully, that we can never even think of the idea of freedom without thinking of the right to movement. She says the term itself, freedom as a concept, has written into it as almost its first principle is the right to movement in relation to human interests. Just to go back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of thinking about interests as a convergent notion across genders, across questions of ethnicity or minorities. A national consciousness, Frantz Fanon once wrote, and I quote him, a national consciousness which is not nationalism and is alone capable of giving us an international dimension is one in which the national culture is built on the politics of difference. And his phrase is, the outcome of tensions, internal and external to a society as a whole and its multiple layers. This is a remarkable early idea which has been forgotten. Du Bois, W.E. Du Bois, the great African-American politician, poet, and prophet, used to always hyphenate international, I-N-T-R, dash national, because there was the same attempt as there is in Fanon to say a national consciousness has to first be international before it can be national. Otherwise, the notion of sovereignty and closed sovereignty will overcome the idea of solidarity. To negotiate these tensions, internal and external to a society, to cross and recross these diverse worldly thresholds, opens the door to a politics of radical hospitality. I'm thinking of Immanuel Kant here, in which the ideas of creative industries and cultural industries find their moral compass and their historical moorings. So it seems to me that in the circulation, global circulation of these goods, practices, and interests in the cultural economy and the creative economy, there should always be a form of hospitality as we send our goods and services across borders. And that hospitality we see in certain industries, in certain cultural industries. But I think hospitality shows also a sense of the desire not only to spread and disseminate, but to understand the dynamics of differentiation, the tensions, the dialectics that function in any part of the world to which we export our goods. It is not just enough to say, you know, we have no responsibility. We put it on the market and it goes. I understand that's the situation. But I'm not called here, nor are we all gathered here, only to affirm what is going on, but to try and think as best we can, and my effort is, I understand, modest, to think about how we might change this transfer and indeed the translation of cultural goods, symbolic ideas and practices.
Professor Papa.
I have argued that I believe in a cultural politics of shared equitable interests rather than the authentication of identities. I've also rejected, in the spirit of Fanon, the ethno-nationalist populisms that narrowly protect their territorial sovereignty rather than facing the intercultural challenges of tense and problematic thresholds of hospitality. Where do I go now as I conclude? I'm inspired in this regard by the African record in cultivating, in the cultural sense of the word, a sense of home and hospitality for refugees. Those countries in the north and south who see themselves as icons of global success have been far more parsimonious in their welcome of the dispossessed and displaced. Africa, with its inherent problems, rises to the challenge of what I call vernacular cosmopolitanism, invested in the values of survival rather than the norms of national sovereignty. The majority of refugees and migrants are cosmopolitan, of course, in a tragic sense. They have not chosen their condition. They're displaced from one country to another, from one camp to another, with the border police at their backs. And yet, these displaced peoples, have found a profound sense of what it means to survive without sovereignty and maintain a measure of integrity and hope in the face of the denial of agency and authority. And when people say, well, many of these refugees who move get into drugs, many of them get into petty thievery and larceny, I think we should begin to understand how they are pushed in these directions by the host countries not actually treating them with the dignity, yes, the dignity of the dignity required for displaced peoples. They are always seen as a problem. This is a form, in my view, of what I call minority, vernacular cosmopolitanism, of a kind of minoritarian perspective on the world, a Fanonian perspective, a Du Boisian perspective that manifests a political will to establish neighborly relations in traumatic and challenging conditions. It is only legally right and morally proper that this will to neighborliness should be reciprocated by host societies extending a right to hospitality. The binding element that increasingly fades from our view of hospitality and neighborliness is a representative sense of the common good. How, without the common good, can we actually provide these goods and services? Not a cohesive, assimilationist common good, but a binding element that creates opportunities for what I call the convergence of diverse interests and differential positions. The role of humanistic education is crucial in the cultivation of a binding element. Now, I use the word convergence because it doesn't entail imposed order or enforced consensus. Convergence assumes that peoples and ideas have different origins, opinions that may have conflicting sources and beliefs, and may attach to plural perspectives, and communities that exist in life worlds of historical specificity. To converge around an agenda is to negotiate the politics for a shared and negotiated project over a certain length of time. This is not the speediness of the culture that we encounter these days. Too often, political principles are framed in universalist terms that everybody piously accepts, repeats, and then violates. The social experience of political change is often experienced as flux, as I said earlier, as suddenness, as transition, or as unpreparedness. Society that's engaged with differences do not homogenize an appropriate otherness. Toleration is commendable, but in my belief, modestly, it is an insufficient ethic of hospitality. Migration and displacement demand that we create a pedagogy of civility and hospitality. that engages with the melancholic, with the vulnerable, with tragic loss, and doesn't keep repeating its affiliations to the positive norms of virtue, of civility. We've got to understand the ebb and flow of normative beliefs and ethical commitments in specific conditions. Citizenship, I believe, also will need to be redefined in our own times, because I think at the heart of citizenship, at the ethical core of any tradition of citizenship, going back to Roman ideas, is the refugee, the displaced person. Citizenship is like doing everything not to return to that condition. And now, when we have roughly, I think, 85 million displaced peoples in the world, these people are not simply others. They belong at the heart of our redefinitions of what global citizenship might be. And I think that is most important to understand. If you read citizenship from its inside out, then all the forms of rights and representations are there in order not to return people to places of displacement. That the center of the onion of citizenship is indeed the displaced person and the refugee. I suggest we now rethink it the other way around. We think from the position of displacement and migration and diasporic xenophobia. We think outside of it to rethink what our moral norms might be. I'm not qualified to talk about the political norms and conventions. If the citizen has standing, the refugee is often left lying by the wayside or abject in the refugee camp. It is in these moments of indignity and inhospitality that we must listen carefully and listen suddenly for what Bob Dylan called the chimes of freedom flashing. Each citizen who lives today in peace and security is a neighbor to another who is neither. Each world citizen is in part a refugee, something of a migrant, living side by side with a family without a home, a child without an education, a society without the basic right of consent, all of which in the cultural sphere, as indeed in the political sphere, has been thrown into a graphic highlight by the pandemic itself. Our experiments with truth, to cite Mahatma Gandhi's great work, must also be experiments with the difficulty of these daunting realities.
Professor Baba,
Yes,
can I request that you conclude, please?
I am.
Thank you.
If you had, I would have concluded it 1 second earlier, madam, so forgive me. And as we set out on the long walk to freedom with Mahatma Mandela, let there be absolutely no occasion on which the stateless or those whose rights are compromised appear to the rest of the world as the wretched of the earth, in Fanon's epochal phrase. The tragic truth contained in Steve Biko's bleak warning, "Black man, you are on your own," must never cast its shadow on the spirit of any woman, man or child who seeks the solidarity of others in making claims to hospitality and neighborliness. Let me end with the unbreakable belief in renewal that stirs in the great prophetic voice of the South African poet Ingrid Jonker. The child is not dead, neither at Langa, nor at Nyanga, nor at Orlando, nor at Sharpeville, nor at the police station in Philippi. The child, this notion of rebirth, is present at all meetings and legislations. The child peeps through the window of houses and into the hearts of mothers. The child who just wanted to play in the sun at Nyanga is everywhere. Thank you very much. And I apologize for the length of my talk, but I tried to do what I could to in the time I had and in the time I took from others. My apologies.
Thank you. Very, very inspiring, Professor Baba. Apologies for interjecting there. I was supposed to stop you 10 minutes ago, but you kept us all fixated on the line of thought that you were sharing with us. Thank you very much. We will move along. Professor will remain online for questions later on. I would now like to take our third presenter, Professor Andy Pratt, who unfortunately will not be able to ignore me because he's right here with us. He is the UNESCO Chair of Global Creative Economy, a Professor of Cultural Economy in the Department of Media, Culture and the Creative Industries in the University of London. Professor Andy Pratt is going to address us talking to a term that gets bandied around a lot these days and gets diluted. But he is going to talk to us about the nuts and bolts of transformation of the creative economy. Over to you. Thank you very much, Prof.
Can I use the one or the handout? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay, great. Thanks very much indeed. That's quite an act to follow, as well as lunch as well, which is always having a soporific effect on you all. So I'll try and wake you all up a tiny bit, and also to take you into a different realm from that of Professor Baba. His work actually was very instrumental in my own work, thinking about this point he mentioned near the end of his talk there, about this notion of in-between spaces and hybridities. And that notion of in-between spaces and hybridities, I think, has been an inspiration to me for a long time, navigating the complex relationships between economics and geographies. And these issues of dealing with what in the traditional disciplinary areas there we often see as dualisms, as things set against one another. Actually, more often than not, it's more helpful to see them as hybridities and of something of the mixing between the two. And certainly my work on the culture and creative economy has been very much about pursuing those admixtures of place, activity, and construction. So all the things such as the relationship between the informal and the formal, and between cultural and creative, between the state and capital, for example. All those things, rather than as binaries, let's see them as more of a mixture. And what I want to do in this presentation, very briefly, is to just very briefly point to some of the overviews that has already been talked about in terms of transformations in the cultural economy in economic terms. And I won't dwell on that because we've had that already. What I want to focus on is the issue about what that means for everyday life, what that means for activity in the actual existing creative economy, rather than this model of the creative economy that we so often deal with for all sorts of good and appropriate reasons in analytic terms. But I think the insight from the activities of the culture and creative economy in terms of organisation and practices help us to perhaps have an additional insight, a different insight, which I think in the end is something that should inform us in terms of policy making. in terms of things we want to change, we've not conceived the object that we want to change correctly, and therefore many of our actions to try to cause change in the creative economy have missed the target. And that's what I want to come back to at the end. But very briefly, you've seen the range of these reports, and people have spoken about them all together, and in a sense the rhetoric of the creative economy. And it's not just rhetoric. I mean, in economic terms, it does do all those things, and probably more as well. But much of this focus has been necessarily on the headline figures. And to an extent, this is a way in which, in any political or policy debate, you have to get your foot in the door. Yeah? You get the politicians to take notice. And it was always said at the time, so I was involved in the creative economy reports at the beginning and also the UNESCO definition of the framework for cultural statistics. This is just a starting point to get us noticed, and then we have to go on and look in more detail at how the cultural economy actually works, as opposed to the idealizations of how it might work under some sort of neoliberal or neoclassical model of the world. So we've got the headline story. What's the next story that we need to talk about? I mean, we have things from the conventional perspective, and that is the under or non-reporting of all sorts of activities. You know, so the trade in services, it's not for any reason, so for good reason that trade in services invariably are called invisibles, because they're invisible. So they're not measured, they're not looked at in that way. Also, intellectual property rights, copyrights, etc., they're also something that's constantly evading us. But also, there is what we heard about this morning, about the informal economy, about all sorts of life that sustains culture, that is outside our measurement terms. So my response to economists often is that if not only does the model not work, but it doesn't even cover 50% of what you're trying to explain, maybe you ought to start somewhere else. Okay? And so I think we desperately need other ways to understand the cultural economy that pays attention to the way that people actually organize themselves and the way that they seek to transform themselves and society. What reminds us of some of these things, I think clearly, is we heard about this UNESCO report that seeks to monitor the 2005 convention and produces an evaluation every now and again to see how things have performed. And it only looks at some aspects of what the 2005 convention on cultural and creative diversity does, but in relation to some of the things where it touches on the creative economy, it says some interesting and troubling things. Is that the real diversity, so this is a convention that is meant to celebrate and promote diversity of expression, but also the action of that in diverse ways as well. However, when we look, we can see many areas that are directly front and central of the cultural and creative economy, like digitization, for example, clearly benefits an elite. And clearly the transformation of economic models that incorporates digitalization often is captured by those that are able to control the means of distribution and also in setting and enforcing contracts and weak positions basically on people. Yeah? There are all sorts of questions that we've had raised earlier that people have mentioned in terms of the mobility of artists, also issues about in terms of inequalities and barriers to those. Remuneration of artists, we've seen in many points about how badly artists and creatives are paid. Not only that, is that they don't get sick pay generally, they don't have pensions. So how on earth would you, as they talk about in labour markets, reproduce the labour force? i.e., you have to have kids, you have to look after kids. Where does that money come from? So this is a massive question that we need to be asking in terms of representations of gender. Not only is that not in terms of parity, but where women are employed, they're overrepresented in the lower skilled jobs. Yeah, so issues about that is also reproduced in terms of ethnicity and race, and also discrimination in terms of gender. There is also, as we've said, an imbalance of trade between the global north and south. So this is not a great scorecard, quite honestly. So it's not a criticism of efforts to try to change things. They are hardly visible. This is part of the problem. We need to make this visible and to understand what the problem is in terms of the culture and creative economy, and then think about trying to fix it in some way. Yeah? So that's what I'm pointing to here. And I can just point to very quickly some of the macro challenges to the creative economy as well. As Justin mentioned, state funding everywhere is declining rapidly to almost zero. As we've seen in the pandemic, which was a perverse natural experiment of removing culture from our lives, and we found out what no moral and ethics committee would have allowed us to do, which was to impose COVID on the world, and you find out that suddenly culture matters. That question that people always used to ask, what does culture really matter? Yeah? Well, I think the affirmative is there. Now we just need to remember that. So much of the funding and support for the interstices of the cultural and creative economy, that all those activities that link together artists and their audiences were invariably lost in this period. Moreover, we have this huge inherited burden of the asymmetries of trade that is also replicated through access to cultural distribution and cultural markets as well, which again reproduces an asymmetry in terms of access and in terms of the distribution of the benefits of the creative economy. And one issue that we haven't really touched upon today, and there's a lot more that we could say about issues about environmental sustainability, which are a massive problem in this field. Not only the more obvious vulnerability to sea level change, but also the massive waste that is produced by core culture and creative industries, the fashion industry, and anything that involves electronics. Yeah? These things, when your mobile phone runs out, what happens to it? Does it get recycled? Who recycles it? Where in the world does it get recycled? And are there any adequate health and safety conditions on those people, etc., etc.? Yeah, lots of issues there. There is also the question of the carbon footprint of live events. Questions about the way that culture, it may be assumed, many people, that somehow culture is benign and not touching the environment and very light on its feet in the world. Well, look closely. It isn't. And we need to address that issue as well. So I'm not going to provide you with solutions to that, but a way to a solution is to make visible these issues and actually be able to work on them. We've heard already several times about some of the traditional notions of the culture and creative economy. And this model of what David Throsby had referred to as the concentric circles model, etc. What it represents is something far deeper. It's a far greater problem, which is a romantic ideal of the artist. Yeah? Where the artist is at the center of the world and it's almost separated from it. What it doesn't engage with properly is the way that artists and cultural activity are embedded in everyday life and in the world. And to accurately capture that, rather than what I think is often a rather disparaging notion of the wider cultural industries or the related industries, yeah, they're all central. Okay, the hierarchies of them are hierarchies of power and access we need to look at. So this issue is partly one of restricted vision. We have seen the cultural and creative industries through the lens of the artist. It's no wonder we can't see all the support people, all the people working behind the scenes doing the work that actually allows events like this to happen. Okay, so bringing those to the fore and recognize that they have a history, there's a reproduction involved in those skills, in those activities. These are really important issues. And so what we need is a more relational notion of the world, because this notion of the artist at the center is a very atomistic. It's though, just this person there and they're not related to other things. It's about a relational view of the world. And we come back to some of the points that Hame Baba was talking about. The relatedness of activities is a constitutional nature of the cultural and creative industries. So we need an expanded notion of the field of creative economy. And certainly one of the things that we've been trying to develop is a better way of seeing them, not just based on the artist, but based on what we call a production system. And this is an idea of a recursive learning system whereby we start, for example, with an idea, but ideas have to be made into things. They need to be then distributed. They need to meet audiences, and it might be in a commercial market or at a concert of some sort. And then they need to be archived. They are the resource then for thinking about new ideas and differentiation of new ideas. And once you begin to see the cultural production in this wider notion, you wouldn't want to put the artist at the centre. The artist is a key component of this, but so are all the other people that are involved in this collective endeavour of cultural production. And in fact, that UNESCO model that we've seen before that actually includes this at the centre of it, as well as the separate domains. So there's a cycle like this involved in each of those domains of activity. And these are interwoven networks of meaning and value making, multiple values, both economic value and cultural value. And they're embedded in place and time. And there's a process of cultural criticism, but also policy making, of justifying and trying to fix these values. Okay, so that it's not a foregone conclusion what the value of many of the cultural and creative economies. So we can think of this more in terms of a circular economy involving environmental dimensions as well. And I've written about this somewhere else as well. I won't go into detail about that. But although this looks like a bit of a mess, it is just an illustration that you can look at later that actually a model that I've just been talking about, when you plot it out, and this is an example for the music industry, these are all of the activities that are involved in producing a piece of music. Yeah? So it's not the artist, it's a range of infrastructure, of subsidiary activities, etc. And this is what we mean about the cultural and creative ecosystem. So it's a codependency of these activities. And just to take an example, if you don't have any venues, then it's no use being a great performer because nobody's going to come and see you. Yeah? So lose one component of these ecosystems and the whole fails. And this is an example of the sorts of problems that happened in COVID-19 beyond and above the other problems that creatives faced, is that the ecosystems started to fall apart. Performing spaces, recording studios, or managers, or agents, those sorts of things. So what I'm putting this up to do is to illustrate that actually is a whole wide area of activity, both commercial and non-commercial, that is invariably involved in cities, but it's embedded in places that constitutes this cultural and creative economy, rather than just the idea of this next person that you saw on stage. So we need some new visibilities of seeing how power and control operates in this field. Partly, this is rejecting a rather standard neoclassical approach, which only focuses on individuals and markets, and really is focusing on the constitution of markets, the way they're made up of social and economic interactions. Yeah? So we need to know how markets are made. And we all know that in areas that people have mentioned this already in terms of demand, for example, that Herbert Esquith was talking about, that demand is constructed. People don't just suddenly decide which music they like, but there's a whole process of education, of learning about music, of learning of different styles, and then there's all sorts of advertising, there's also other forms of promotion, and therefore it's not, in the end, we generally like common things. That's partly to do with the power of these monopoly organizations. Yeah? It's not as though creatives sort of just come up with an idea and then an audience flocks to them. There's a process involved here. There are institutions that involves educating people, it involves building audiences, building music scenes or reading scenes. It's a whole wider society that again is not involved. And the supply and demand can be structured and controlled if organizations such as large multinationals control access to parts of those things, whether it be Spotify with distribution or a major company like Amazon controlling access to internet services. And regulation is an internal part of that. So regulation often is dealing with that problem that was created. And I just want to point out that the actually existing creative economy is more like this hybrid activity where it's definitely not business as usual. It's business as unusual in the sense that there's a speed of turnover of activity. To produce a car may take 2 or 3 years to set up a new model. With a music or writing, with a newspaper, it might be a matter of a day. Yeah, so new products every day. So think about the organization of producing that amount of newness throughout the period. How you do that, the risk involved. And this is a key issue of the cultural and creative economy, that it's centrally about risk, because you don't know what your audience will like. You can try to convince them beforehand with writing articles about them and encouraging people to see the things that you say will be good, but you don't know. And the risk in the cultural and creative industries is something like 20% of things, if you're lucky, are successful. 80% fail. So now your job is to go out and make an industry out of an 80% failure rate. The fact that the creative economy works is a testament to the success of that system, about how people do it. To conventional economists, to banks, etc., they just think these people are crazy. Yeah? It doesn't mean they're crazy, it's that there are ways of dealing with this and managing this. Portfolio management is one example of this. But we have all of these problems in terms of trying to understand the relationship between production and consumption, the construction of markets, the construction of supplier relationships, the construction of makers, the relationship between the formal and the informal. This is what the creative economy looks like. And it involves these. So again, just an immediate point here is that if you're focused either on the economic value or on the power of the state, then really you're only going to be touching something like 30 or 40% of this whole area. So policy is not going to be effective, and conventional economics is not going to be effective, because it just doesn't play by the rules. Yeah? So these are a different set of rules, and a different sort of understanding, I think, is what we need to bring to this problem. And I think when we begin to see the broader sense of the creative economy, it's like looking at the below sea of an iceberg. Yeah? There's a lot more there than we expected. And likewise, at the beginning, in terms of the headline measurements, actually, it's a lot bigger than we expected, but it's a lot more complicated than we expected as well. And I think we should expect to find, as in terms of case study work that we've done and this project on global production networks that I'm working on with the European Union at the moment, is that we find trans-local cultural production networks. Yeah? So this flow across borders and across spaces, the unequal interdependencies and the flows of knowledge and opportunity that are involved in them, we need to map those, not just the outcomes in terms of GDP, it's the actual organization of the industries, because that's about who gains and who loses and who comes to be invisible in this process. Yeah? We've had an invisibilization of huge amounts of people in this. I mean, that's my criticism often of economics, is that where are the people? Yeah? It's about flows of economic values, but not about the people that actually make those things and do those things and distribute those things or suffer as a result of that. And likewise, the cultural and creative industries, it's the role of people involved in here and the way that our lenses that we've adopted in the past often make invisible things that we should see and actually many of the things that we should act upon. And so a further point there is about the embedding of activities in places and cultures, which is what gives them particular meaning. It's where values come from. Yeah? So the creation of particular values and their differentiation from other values is why we are interested in cultural diversity. Yeah? Because we're interested in that interplay and the questioning of different perspectives of the world. And therefore, we should be looking at the processes of how that happens and how it changes. And basically, there's a big problem with policy. And I've got 2 slides left, so I'm getting to the end, okay? I can see the warning coming. So, because people matter. Yeah, and we recognize people here. So we need to reject many of the normative approaches. They've only given us a limited perspective of what I would argue, we should be looking at. We need to be attentive to organizational patterns and social value as well as economic value and the networks and embedded institutions that constitute the everyday life of activities. Unfortunately, much public policy is built upon these rather strange institutions that divide the world up in these separate areas like silos. These are grain silos, yeah, in which everything happens in an up-down way. Lateral thinking is not allowed. And for goodness sake, what is creative thinking but lateral? Yeah? So, it's going against the very grain of activities. And basically, final slide, is that what we need is a creation of new institutions for creative economy governance. The existing institutions will actually undermine or displace the activities that we're trying to support, and a new institutionalism that actually requires us to look more closely, make nuanced understanding of organizations and intermediation, and also things like capacity building. What stops people participating often is that they're not being supported to actually develop the skills, to develop the intermediaries, etc. between these. I won't go into any more detail about this. You can look at the slides later. But my point is that the cultural and creative economy, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, and the quantitative aspects of it gives a rather skewed perspective. We need a broader perspective, one that includes organizations and institutions. And in fact, one of the big things that cultural policy as state institutions can often do very effectively, rather than picking winners to give them grants, etc., is to support ecosystems and support systems which will then be a future a breeding ground for future ideas. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andy Pratt. Very insightful recommendations there that you are making. I'm sure they are assisting and are going to assist us a lot coming out of this conference. A round of applause for all 3 of the presenters, ladies and gentlemen. I am now going to invite my co-chair, Ms. Flavia Mutsisi. I hope I said that correctly. She is the commissioning editor at MultiChoice. I was asking her whether MultiChoice and Showmax are the same thing. She said, same side of one coin, or 2 sides, actually. A round of applause for Flavia as she takes over.
Thank you so much, Chair. Shoo, that was so enlightening and insightful, and I wish we had more time to unpack more. Thank you so much to our highly esteemed panelists for the insights that they shared with us. More especially Dr. Hubert, who went into more stats around kickstarting us on what the global creative economy looks like on a practical level, and of course followed by a so philosophical, poetic, and a very beautiful delivery from Professor Baba around the creative industries, which was very nuanced. And of course, then we ended up with Professor Andy Pratt, who went beyond just talking about the stats, but started talking about policy and how change can be implemented practically. I think as a closing statement, it would be great to sort of pose a question to all the panelists that can be answered from your different point of views. And I just think that we all want to know, in plain English, as brief as possible, what are the trends that are driving the global creative economy? How do we implement practical change to combat the challenges and the tensions that we face? And basically what we're asking is where to from now? And I think we would really appreciate it if the question would also be answered from an African point of view. And once that's, the question is answered, we will then open up to the floor. Thank you. I think we can start with Dr. Hubert. Professor Hubert. Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if I need to repeat the question.
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I cannot start because the host, okay, it seems that you don't want me to start my video. No problem. First, thank you. I'm not a professor. So, and in my country, only medical MDs have the title of doctor. So Hubert is perfect with me. I really don't know where we are going. If things, I mean, today, anybody telling you that he or she knows will be a liar. I'm a statistician, I'm a professional liar, but even that I will not say. Things are changing so quickly. For example, Professor Baba said, before, there were a difference between the private and the public spheres, and a third part. First, I mean, before, in a long time, cultural production were basically religious production, and there were no difference between the private and the public spheres when in religious matters. We had a 100 years gap where individuals, through neoclassical, enlightenment, liberal things, at least in Europe, were able to think and to have their own choice, which may differ from the public choice. I'm afraid that this is closing down. This window is closing down, and we won't have, I hope I'm wrong, but we may return to some kind of uniformity where we won't have anymore this global consumer, where someone from Africa could appreciate music from Asia, Bollywood, and someone from India may enjoy the movies from Nigeria, Nollywood. I'm afraid that, unfortunately, we are returning to this kind of regionalism where nations and regions closes down. But perhaps it's the bad influence of what's going on today, both in Ukraine and the return of geopolitics. But on that, I'm pretty pessimistic. Otherwise, the nice thing about new technologies is that everyone, and I will close on that, everyone, thanks to those cheap things, can invent, can create. And this is very nice. So I see the future as a fight between a return to bigotism, you know, the woke thing, and individual freedom. And this fight between the public pressure and the individual creativity will remain. Who win? I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hubert. Could you please clap hands for him? Thank you. Professor Baba, you so openly gave us a powerful line from Mr. Baldwin, rather, about we are really or we are really prepared for our new times. So what are those times looking like now from your point of view, and what are the trends?
So thank you, first of all. Thank you very much. It's been really illuminating, and for me to be with the with my panelists, who I also want to thank. You know, I rather like Dr. Hubert Escates. I mean, I think it's very difficult it's very difficult to think about the present, but I think that's what I did for more time than I should have spoken. So I really don't know what I can add to that. I talked about a whole range of issues, and I'm very interested in, as I said, that there are systemic and structural issues, systemic racism, systemic discrimination in health economies for certain groups, etc. And yet when things present themselves with what I'm calling as the suddenness of their presence, and this is not just my invention, what's very interesting is that throughout the George Floyd events, most black activists, artists, writers, thought about it as a moment. Many of them say, how do we think of a moment? We are trained to think in long lines of time, long temporalities. In fact, the longer the landscape of time, the more authoritative you sound, because you see the proportionalities, you see the averages, and I'm trying to disrupt that. And I think that really, if the question you asked me, you know, what does the world look like to you? I think I've already spoken a great deal about that. So I don't want to unnecessarily take the time from my colleague, and I have to say that I found Andy's presentation also very generative, and I thank him for his generosity in recognizing my work. Then let me just say two things in response, actually, to my panelists. First of all, in relation to Dr. Escape, you know, when I talked about the public and the private domains, I was tracking a history of about 300 years. Of course, and even in that period, it's complicated, because religion in itself is always, in my view, a hybrid of the individual and the institution, or the creed and the governing idea. So I think religion, in fact, is a very interesting way of thinking of the hybridization of public and private, even if you don't have individualism freedom, if you don't have individual freedom. And it is so interesting now that forms of politics, geopolitics, and biopolitics that liberal Democrats find most difficult to take are the theocratic, theological, political movements in the world that we see. Because the whole notion of who is the individual, what is sacrifice, what is martyrdom, what is independence, what is autonomy, the politicization of those subjects in relation to the Western democratic mentality is very different. So I think that I want to make that point, that there was always a kind of tension between the religious and the secular, even if the secular was not recognized. Anyway, so I just want to make that point, and that's what I was trying to get at. And the other interesting point I'd like to relate to is Andy's notion of the concentric. I talked about the convergent, and I would like to hear what he thinks about it, because I think the concentric still depends on a certain core and its peripheries. And everything that I took away from Andy's very lively conversation was that in cultural production, we need more and more to think about convergent skills and talents rather than concentric ones. So I was trying to shift that ground a bit, and I'd be interested to see if indeed Andy thinks it's even worth referring to. And then the other thing I was trying to do was, you know, when the world enters the house enters the world, and the screen, various kinds of screen mediate that experience, more or less in a very exaggerated way in the pandemic. I think that I was proposing that the symbolic and the economic, if you like, to some extent come closer than ever and reflect each other. But that was a more philosophical point, and I just was thinking about it, having read the materials that I was not familiar with, but maybe I was too quick to propose something. My apologies.
Thank you so much, Professor. Could we please clap hands for him? So, Professor,
Hi, thanks.
in response to the question that was posed as well.
Just checking whether the microphone is on. Hello? Is it on? Is this one on? Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, that was really interesting, different dimensions there. I guess the point that I've got is a rather simplistic one, but very important. Unfortunately, I see today as the period in which work in the culture and creative industries is immiserated. It's about precarity. It's about separation and the creation of differences that are unwelcome. And I think what the opportunity for us as those that are interested in reflecting upon that is A, to point it out, and B, to think about how to change it. Because it's not good at the moment, not good for people's livelihoods, it's not good for people's emotional life, and it's not good for the culture. And therefore creating these different visibilities and also ways out of a mindset that seems built upon the idea of us all being, in the literature, like mechanical Turks. We're just accepting these micro jobs from large companies and producing widgets from them. And I think that direction is clearly we're not there at the moment, but I think we need to question what it is that produces that system. And it's about technology, and it's a questioning of technology, that it's a socio-technical relation. It's not a thing. It's something that is mediated and can be remediated in this way. And I think looking at the changing, quite simply, the means of production and the way that we control them is the way forward, is what we need to think about. And I think looking back, we see to an extent how we've failed in many ways to do those things, and we need to try again and try harder.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. In lieu of time, Dr. Khumalo, I'd like to just open up to the floor for just one or two questions to our highly esteemed panelists. So we can conclude the conversation. Do we have any questions? Yes, there's a question right there. Do we have microphones that we can pass on, perhaps?
No, it's not working. Can you hear me?
We can.
My name is Lisa Combrink. I'm from the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. You know, I think that the picture that's been painted to us is a reality check, but it's also quite gloomy, isn't it? So I want to ask possibly an even gloomier question, and that is, you know, based on the contributions that we've heard in this panel, is the elephant in the room not actually the F word we will not utter, and that is fascism, looming larger than life, so big in the world that we pretend not to see it because it's also consuming. A few companies, so-called, so-named creative companies, controlling the world, with the rest of all of us becoming more invisible. A few governments, and then a few more companies appropriating the works of universities on research and vaccine development, profiting from publicly funded initiatives. And then perhaps a few influencers, mainly, it seems, in California, dictating our cultural desires and their copycats elsewhere. Isn't that what we're actually facing? Isn't that what we refuse to name, but what we must address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm not sure which of our panelists would like to make a comment on that.
I can. I empathise with what you're saying, and I think it's the recognition. I think we need to recognise not the hype, but actually the reality of what's going on. And that's why I would argue that rather than looking at the difference in economic value, we need to focus on power differentials in many of these systems that we're talking about or activities we're talking about, and interrogate who's got the power, how they got it, and also the way that that shapes whatever forms of cultural expression we have or are denied. And I think sometimes economics likes to see itself as separate from all these value judgments, whereas I believe that it's more of a political economy whereby we actually need to address these questions of inequality of power and control, as well as the economic system in terms of thinking about how actually existing creative economies operate.
Thank you for that. Do we have one last question?
May I add something?
Please go for it.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I will be short. There is no change. Do you think that before people were independent, were not under the pressure of fashion? It's just the sole difference for the small guy is that the influencer is no more in the capital city, is somewhere in California. But for the small guy, there is no difference. There is perhaps a process of acculturation, but in terms of individual freedom, I don't see a lot of difference. And perhaps more freedom today because you can choose your influencer than before, when you were in a village, you had to follow the rules of the village, otherwise, I mean, you could be killed. I mean, in my country, people could be burned because they were not following the rituals and the mode and things and the fashion. So I frankly speaking, I agree, but I don't think it's a bad thing. Sorry for being...
Thank you so much for the answer. Professor, I don't know if you want to add on to the question.
Yeah, I actually think that Lisa has pointed to something extremely significant, and she focuses, I think quite rightly, on the collusion between certain, large, let's call it media companies, but other, Twitter and so on, these large companies and their collusion with certain governments. And I think that collusion, which is not by my term a convergence, because people don't come with a sense of their difference, regional or otherwise, that collusion is extremely problematic, and you see it in the States. But I think there is a further issue, if I might just raise it to you all, probably who know it well. But there is a way in which, and I want to, in which regionalism is also constructed. Regionalism isn't just the voice of people from the region, so that one form of hegemonic normalization of difference is, for instance, like Netflix, which I watch compulsively, by the way. But let me just tell you, Netflix has this model where it, gets local people in India or in Africa, I'm just now watching something about Lebanon, to make their works. Now, this is a sponsored kind of regional differentiation. Some of it is good, some of it is not so good. But I think that the way in which hegemonic power works, it can also work through normalizations of issues or normalizations of what actually look as if they're the articulation of different people, different regions. And to some extent they are, but to some extent they aren't. Once again, I want to say that we are on the threshold, and what we have got to understand is that the threshold isn't sitting on the fence. The threshold isn't being sort of above or on the fence. The threshold is the flux of the everyday, to go back to what both my colleagues on the panel said, but trying to theorize that moment of transition, trying to theorize the everyday, not by saying, this is completely different. Every culture, every moment in history, there have been moments of transition. Transition is not a natural phenomenon, just like hybridization is not a natural phenomenon. You construct to answer a particular problem, you construct a particular analytic framework. And I think for the moment, the issue of, these threshold tensions, hospitality is also the problem of crossing a threshold. Neighborliness, minorities, these are the problems, the tension of the threshold. I think this is quite important, but I very much agree with Lisa. I would only ask her to think about how these hegemonic powers work and how you can homogenize through differences.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. I'll hand over to our chair. Okay, let me hand over to our Master of Ceremonies. Thank you so much for the panel discussions and for the questions and for the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for letting me gate crash your session. Thank you so much. You can leave the stage. Just a slight program change. The last plenary session will fall away and will be incorporated into the session tomorrow in the interest of time. You can speak to Amy in the bright pink top if you have any questions about that or how exactly that's going to work, so we can make time. Please may I ask that we make our way to the next plenary sessions, and let's begin with those. Can I just remind you, before you leave the room, that we have a cocktail and canapes event on the deck after the final plenary. Please stay with us for as long as possible. Enjoy interacting with academics, people in the creative sector from all around the world and all around South Africa for the rest of the day. Please don't rush off after we've done the last plenary. And I can invite our next panelists to make their way to the stage. A round of applause for them, please, as they do so. Thank you.
I'll be guided when we are good to start, Amy. Okay. Thank you to everyone for their patience, by the way. I see people are walking in with popcorns, so it's really going to be a digital experience, a theatrical experience that we're about to have. Hopefully soon, because we have kept a few people waiting online, which we greatly appreciate. Not sure if they can hear us already. But apologies once again. We are hoping to still get through what we need to get through and get the discussions on this important topic going. I see Amy is like ready to climb over that control room to give us the confirmation that we're ready to proceed. Okay, I think where I come from, in times like these, we'll just burst into song. But we can try. At this point, I'm willing to try anything. It's been a long afternoon of really ingesting quite deep content. I think, at this point, instead of me saying, okay, let's stand up and stretch and all that, I can easily just... I wouldn't ask you, DM, to start a song.
We can ask Lisa to sing a fascism song.
Woo! I thought it would be easier with anyone but you, DM. But after hearing Lisa's comments, I'm also just worried about her now. The kind of song she may start may end us in the newspapers for the wrong reasons. We don't want that. We don't want that. And probably my song will too. But so I will spare everyone. Okay, we're good.
Good to go.
Good to go. Thank you very much. A very good afternoon, a good morning, good evening, whatever time of day it is. From wherever in the world you may be connecting with us. Thank you for your patience, and apologies for those that have been waiting online for us to start. We know that we are starting at a time different than was allocated, but I can assure you that it will still be a worthwhile engagement. A warm welcome to the panel, a panel that is brought to you in collaboration between the Conversation Africa and Saco. And the title of this panel is Securing a Seat at the Table, How African Creatives Can Thrive in the Digital Era. I'm really looking forward to having an engagement. And, moderating the panel for you this afternoon is yours truly, Zamam Kosi. I am a 20-year media and entertainment lawyer that has been around for a while, and a creative industry advocate, have held various roles in the public sector as well as the private sector. Very much all of these roles positively impacting the growth and the development of the creative industries. I'm also a keen student of the integration of African firms into global value chains. So that is who is going to be moderating for you. And I hail from the township of Umlazi, south of Durban, KwaZulu-Natal. I grew up to the sounds of Istatamiya and gumbo dance from the nearby hostels, particularly Cleveland's hostel, to those that are listening, those that may not be around. But to this day, as a result of hearing those sounds, I can still identify distinctly, the sound of that Statamia sound and that gumbo dance sound, even if it's a hip hop song, even if it's an electric dance song, I can hear that sound still distinctly to this day. But what often fascinates me is how back Mlazi and even Lady Smith, for that matter, the originators and the composers of those sounds probably do not know the extent, or let alone see the fruit of the benefit of how far the impact of their creative works has traveled, and the influence that they have held in impacting genres of music and even other art forms all over the world. Now, digitization particularly, during the pandemic times, we know that it is to be applauded and celebrated for really making it very easy and possible, because it broke down the means of content creation and the means of market access. However, all of these developments do not come without a cost. They do come at a cost, and the solutions are less than simple, because it is a complicated industry, as we have heard throughout the day. And to help us deliberate this afternoon on some of the realities of African creatives thriving in the digital era is my esteemed panel. Firstly, it's the Honorable Deputy Minister of the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, Ms. Noqawe Noncedo Mafu. And I have Dr. Akhona Nzuta, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Chief Albert Lutuli Research Chair at UNISA. She researches the intersection of South African music, public policy, and cultural management. And online, I also have Prof. Ribeiro Zenza. I trust that he has connected with us. He is a cultural economist who is a director of culture department at Sengo International University in Alexandria. And last but not least, I've got Dr. Marisa Henderson, who is a chief director in the Creative Economic Program, which is part of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Now, you can be assured, and those that are in the house, you can dig into your popcorns at this point, because you are about to hear from this very esteemed panel on matters that relate to the digitization of the industry and how our African creatives can fruitfully and sustainably participate. So starting with you, Deputy Minister, for obvious protocol reasons, whether you like it or not, please just take us through, what does the road to digitization of the creative industry look like from a government point of view? And what is government doing to support the industry through this shift? Your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much, Zama, and greetings to everybody who is in this conversation. Of course, it is a conversation, and a conversation, therefore, by nature, is that everybody benefits from it. It is not only us here that will be the experts. We also hope that we will learn something from the people that are with us. And I hope you also heard that everybody that is in the panel with me has got a prefix, a doctor, a professor, and me, you heard that Miss. No Tshwane, no Ncedo Mafu. You heard that, ne? So you don't expect much from me. So I thought I must quickly do that so that your expectations are a little bit lowered in terms of what I'm going to say. But on a more serious note, digitization has really caught us, as particularly the creatives in the country and in Africa in general. When COVID-19 actually reared its head, everybody had to actually learn standing up and understanding what is going on now, because you are here as a creative. You need to have your work being out there. You are on lockdown. And therefore, you had to quickly understand what this digitization is all about, quickly, and learn as you go. And one of the things then that is important is that there's been hiccups, of course, but also the important thing is that you have not been given an opportunity to learn this skill at school or anywhere. Now, here is an opportunity and a situation that we must deal with. These are the things that I thought government had to look at and assist the creatives and the artists. Of course, we put some funds available as the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture to say, we are going to put you, we're going to assist you to put your work out there in the digital space. Yes. But of course, remember, the creatives had to go and knock to somebody else who is going to help them to take their work into the digital space, because they don't have the skill for that. And that is an added cost on them that they now had to work on. Secondly, if you are a South African like myself, you would know the cost of data in this country. Data in South Africa has got the most expensive data in Africa. And therefore, on top of the cost that we have to deal with, data is becoming another problem. Much as we are interacting with our sister departments, like communications and DTIC, to say, look, we need to make sure that data becomes accessible, because it is very clear, even beyond lockdown, that digitization is here to stay. And we need to make sure that South Africans in general understand how to navigate into that space. And navigating into that space must also not mean economic constraints for us because of the expensiveness of the data. Yes. So those are the things that are very critical for us, that we thought is important. Of course, digital platforms need technical expertise, which I've already spoken about. South Africans are starting to get grips with it now, but compared to our sisters and brothers in other African countries, we would agree that we are a little bit behind. If we are compared with Kenya, Kenya is a bit a step ahead of us. If we are compared with Nigerians, when it comes to creatives and putting it out there, they are better than us. So we need to make sure that we skill ourselves better as South Africans to be able to compete in that space. And government, which I represent, must make sure that young people, because young people are the ones that love to be in the digital space. Young people like to be on all these things, Twitter, TikTok, whatever you want to call it. And we need to make sure that as they get there, how do we make sure that, like their brothers and sisters in other countries, they are able to make money out of that? Yeah. They are in the north, if you talk about in the developed countries, young people are earning money out of the digital space, more than South Africans or Africans, because we still do not understand how that economy functions. And we need to make sure that we educate our people. It is not about entertainment only. We can make money there. And South Africans in particular, they are just using that platform just for entertainment when the other people are becoming millionaires out of us. That's another thing. The other thing that is worrying about the digital space for me is the fact that the creatives still need to understand how they must protect their intellectual property in that space. Because now you've got your work out there, anybody has got access to it. If you do not know how to manage it, it means somebody else is going to be a millionaire out of your work while you still remain poor. How then do we make sure that we do that? That's why the government, therefore, when it comes to two bills that are important, the copyright and the issue of the performance bill, that will be able to protect the artists and the creatives, has been passed in Parliament after a long time.
Yes.
I have to say, after a long time.
Yeah, long.
It's been long coming. Remember, it was out there. President took it back to Parliament. He was not happy about some clauses on it. It has now gone to both houses. It has gone to the National Parliament, and it has gone to the NCOP. It is ready now for the President's signature. We hope that that will also assist the creatives in that space. Thanks, Sama.
Thank you, DM. Thank you. And I think maybe you mentioned a point there about the, the other youngsters that are in digital spaces in developed countries that making lots of money. I just want to bring it back into practicality, Dr. Nzuta, because most of us are parents out there and we're sitting with youngsters that now say they don't want to go to school, they just want to be YouTubers and make lots of money because the economy is now digitized. The creative and cultural, industries are now digitized, and that's where that's where they want to be. But just be practical with us and tell us in practical terms, what does it actually mean, the digitization of CCIs? Sorry to use that word.
Okay. Thanks for having me on this panel, first of all. I'm glad the Deputy Minister has covered a lot of the ground, because I was really wondering if we really want to be at this table where we digitize the economy, right? In practical terms, I think we need to be realistic of our socio-economic environment. Should we be at the table if the terms at which we're at the table don't suit us or are not part of our reality, right? For instance, we're grappling with two things from that very idea of digitizing the economy. It's a doing thing. Are we standardizing the economy to be digital? We've got the economy, which is struggling already, right? And that has implications to how we engage with digital life, right? And then digital life itself, how do we engage with digital life or participate in digital life if the very things to sustain it aren't there? For instance, electricity, right?
Yeah.
And the second thing, being digital norms, as the Deputy Minister has mentioned. Copyright deals with digital norms, right? And protecting ourselves, protecting our IP. That has been a very contentious issue for a very long time. And even though it seems to have been resolved because it's been approved in Parliament, what does it actually mean for practitioners? Because we know that the sector's fragmented, for instance, right? And so I know some people did not approve of the fair use principle, right? Because for our context, it doesn't seem viable, right? So in realistic terms, let me now give you the policy process spiel, right? So for policy interventions like this, they really should be country-specific context, rather country context specific, supportive and holistic interventions that are sensitive to each developmental environment, right? And so, for instance, it would be better if interventions like this, where the policy or program involved are CCI driven, they already sort of look at ways that the CCIs already work with digital technology, right? Because they understand their conditions, right? They already exist in this fray. But also, you know, I like the fact that throughout the conference so far, we have there's been emphasis on the professionalized parts of the sector and the unprofessionalized, or rather formalized work, right? So what do we have to say about that, for instance? Okay, I just made notes here. For instance, do you want good labor practices, right, to happen in this digitized space, this digitized economy, or do you want to act like the, where it's standard for economies to be digital or digitized? Are we superimposing the best practices of other geopolitical zones which might be toxic for ourselves, right? So there are a lot of things to consider. And then the fact that, one other thing is, we don't document and monitor a lot of the stuff that happens in South Africa. Thank goodness for Saco, right? But then they've only been around for a very short space of time. And who else does research in South Africa into these matters in terms of mapping out the behavior of people in the sector? One last point is the fact that we don't really reach out to other regions in terms of understanding how the CCIs actually work. And I'm talking about rural areas.
Yes.
So we behave in urban areas and peri-urban areas very differently to how cultural practitioners in different parts of South Africa behave. And that is also something that needs to be brought into the reality of how we want to think about the digital, or rather digitizing the economy of the creative, sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nzuta, for that. Now, Professor Nzeza, I hope you can hear us. I would like to bring you in at this point because we've said that we've heard in the panel that government is obviously a key enabler of the creative economy, as it is the case with other industries. And maybe bringing a bit of a regional perspective, what, in your view, would be the role of government? What should governments be doing really to enable the inclusivity and the sustainability of the CCIs in this digital era?
Thank you very much, Zama, for the question. I think the simple answer to that question would be that the government should devise a cultural policy that will tackle all the issues related to the culture, and maybe merely a cultural policy that will be more concentrated on the CCI sector. But it will be very nice to have a systemic point of view in the sense where the cultural sector should be in touch with other related sectors of the human life of the country or of the continent. I can give the example of the digital plan. Many countries in Africa have the digital plan. The digital plan is not related only to the cultural sector, but it's related to health, to education, to the economy, to security. And the government should work, or the ministry in charge of art and culture should work with other ministries, by example, the ministry in charge of ICT, to make sure that the digital plan that will be implemented will take into account other issues that would be beneficial to the cultural sector. That is the first idea, because we often observe a gap between the hard parts, the infrastructure, the backbone, the internet speed, with the content, because without the content, we will have nothing to be circulated through the network. On the other side, in that systemic perspective, the government should work, or the Ministry of Culture and Art should work also with the Ministry in charge of the economy, because we have also the digital economy. We have method of payment and other issues that should be also beneficial to the creative sector. So the Minister in charge of art and culture should not work separately from other components of the society. And the last point is to promote entrepreneurship. because most of the creatives are small and medium enterprises. They are freelancers, they work remotely, they have part-time jobs, and they are very vulnerable according to the shock. And the COVID-19 experience has shown us the setbacks of that situation. And the government should encourage or have regulation that will support the strengthening of capacities, of skills, to know how to navigate, how to work in the digital era, because the whole creative value chain has been transformed according to the digital. And the last point should be to support the financial institution that must provide financial services according to the nature of the work in the creative field.
Thank you so much. And I like that bringing in the whole value chain of the industry, and also not limiting it just to that industry. I think we've had other speakers talking about that as well earlier, the importance of the ecosystem that recognizes that there are other industries that also contribute to the creative industries, and therefore our solutions should be holistic. But I'm coming to you, Dr. Anderson, just for the point to give us a global view. A global view around, I think earlier you spoke about some of the interventions from the different governments out there. So maybe your thoughts around what could be adapted and learned between different countries, because no country, no government is an island.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by sharing with you that one of the key things that Uberscade has said in the previous panel really apply for this one as well. And I have the privilege of working with him in the publication he was mentioning. This was published by UNCTAD. It's the Creative Industry 4.0. And you can download that for free from the UNCTAD, the UNCTAD website. And it's exactly the question that you asked me. It shows how come countries, developing countries, benefit from the current technology. And he said something very interesting. He talked about the transfer of technology. And many years ago, in the 70s, 80s, there was this conversation about transfer of technology. This is easier than ever. Having the internet has become a way of transfer of technology. And an example that happened at the beginning of the lockdown, where we saw a group of kids, teenagers, eating, dancing in Angola, the Jerusalem. I'm sure you saw that.
Yes.
Okay, a beautiful song by South Africa, I understand. And I can't tell you the impact that had in Europe. It was the spirit of us all there. I live in Switzerland, and the very serious and professional Swiss police started to practice the Jerusalem, and they did a video with the Jerusalem. We were all very, very proud of the Swiss police singing to that. But really shows how using something that was available, a technology that was available, a few kids did something that had major impact. And while I completely understand there are major barriers and there are global crisis, and I will speak about that, I think we also need to take advantage of this moment in time when we have this technology available. And UNCTAD is here to support, like many other organizations, to support countries to take advantage of the new technologies for their development gains, to maximize trade and development gains. So in terms of, they're doing wonderful things on the digital economy to reduce the digital gap, which is a global phenomenon. And so this is what we're doing at the global level, at least in that, helping countries with that. Another thing that I wanted to mention about the use of technology, that this picture and describing this report is the rural areas. When we think about new technologies, sometimes we think, cities, as you were mentioning, but actually, even in rural areas, the use of technologies have been considerable and can be very beneficial for the rural areas, particularly in creative industries, where maybe you don't have an opera house in the rural areas, but you do have the normal festivals where there are songs and this and the other. So the creative economies and the digital revolution also has an incredible advantage for the products, services, and products in rural areas, and to reach the regional market, the local market. So in that sense, I think it's very important. There are global level processes going on at the moment, so we have to be very cautious. Our Secretary General, Fangtad, has mentioned that we are at the moment in a global crisis, economic crisis, we are in an energy crisis, and we are in a climate change crisis. So she says that instead of saying these are very, very important issues, we shouldn't pay attention to cultural issues, she said the opposite. She said that because culture and creative industries are so important, more than ever, we need to help support countries to maximize their gains from creative industries. Jen Snowball this morning mentioned the idea of the creative economy is a cyclical economy, in the sense that when things are going very well in the global in the national economy or in the global economy, creative economy generally features positively. When we are in a crisis, we are in a recession, and so on, things are not so good because the consumer is afraid of expending money in things like theater or dance. So it is for these times, at times where we have crises like that, is that we need to prepare ourselves and double the energy to support and have a dialogue between government and private sector. So that is, my last point would be how to win the global sphere. Two more things. Hubert made an important point about consumption, that we generally don't pay attention too much on consumption, and I'm guilty of that, and he always reminds me that. And I think it's very important to look at the consumption in the case of trade, is imports, and take advantage of the imports, not say, we are net importers of this. Maybe the net importer produces a very beneficial effect in the economy because you can produce goods with the things that you import. So the import side is very important. I think we need to pay attention. And to finish up, there are global processes that are currently taking place. For example, the G20, where South Africa is part of the G20. The issue of creative industries was discussed in two working groups that were very important. One was in culture, and the other was in the tourism working group. And for the first time, it was discussed in the tourism working group. Last time, for the first time, it was discussed in the culture working group of the G20. So there is a momentum growing. And I think we need to consider all these different angles to put the creative economy conversation in context.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think there is certainly that high-level global processes at G20 level and so forth, but then there is also at a practitioner level, DM. And I just want to hear, when I asked you first, I asked you about what the role of government should be, but any thoughts, even if it's just one action that you think practitioners, because it's a two-way street, industry development. From your point of view, what would you say will be, key action that will be required from the point of view of the practitioners?
Thanks, Sama. I think from the conversation already, we all agree that digital skills are critical for the future. and are also very critical for the creative themselves. So one critical area that I think the creatives must do is to actually make sure that they empower themselves around the issue of the digital skills. Because remember, if you are able to know how the digital world works, you would be able to do little things that some of us will think that they are minor, like editing videos, like editing pictures. I mean, that's a skill. I can't edit my own pictures. You know.
No need, it's not necessary.
You think so? But also, when creatives put their song on live stream, they must understand, what does that mean? What then do you expect out of putting your song on live stream? So I'm saying, for me, skilling themselves around this is very critical. And governments can also assist to make sure that they actually invest on digital literacy. Because then, that way, everybody, even young people growing up, must actually be understanding how this area of work functions. In a continent like ours, where traveling intra-Africa is very expensive. I mean, if you think about going to Morocco right now, you have to think about traveling to Dubai, then Dubai to Morocco. There's no direct flight that takes you to Morocco. There's no direct flight that takes you to Nigeria. You must go via Addis, and then you understand. Yeah. So digital literacy is critical, because then it will help African continent, even the creatives themselves, to be able to share their creative work and connect with each other in Africa. Because it is going to be easier than traveling to African countries. So digital literacy is very critical for me, that every creative, every cultural expert must at least have some little knowledge of how this works. And I really want to believe that African countries must also put some budget or anything on making sure that we've set up these cultural observatories, so that there is more research that is being done in Africa, the research tanks and everything, so that we are able to share knowledge on things that have been researched and are scientific. Yes. So digital literature for me is very critical.
Thank you so much, DM. Dr. Nzuta, from an African creative practitioner perspective, this is not the first time that we've had panels like these deliberating on what can be done to ensure a success and sustainability. Where are African creatives falling short? Both the practitioners as well as the policymakers. What are we missing in being able to see the growth that we really want to see in the sector?
All right, sorry, I've got notes. I do want to forget stuff. So if we look at Africa widely, we've been disadvantaged by a few things. Infrastructural problems, our political history, which has disadvantaged us from negotiating equally, or having our, negotiating capacity reduced at these platforms, global platforms of trade, for instance, right? We've got insufficient economic muscle to digitize, right? To realize or drive digitization. We've also got very little political will to prioritize a holistic approach to the well-being of citizens in the sense of culture and how people actually engage with culture, right? And how culture is part of their lives. You know, you don't have to prove anything. It just is, right? So, you know, in an Africa-wide outlook, this is really what's going on. But I'm not really skeptical about digitization. It's just that it would be better to bring everybody else up, yes, not to sort of confine it to the few who can afford to be online, right? So digitizing the economy really excludes a large portion of the South African CCI population and South African population generally, right? Because high earning income groups, those in urban areas, those of a younger generation are online, right? But then apart from that, apart from access to the internet and the fact that it's expensive and the fact that people are really subsidized in terms of how they use the internet by either institutions of learning or their employers, right? Apart from that, communication technologies are actually expensive. And with a shrinking economy, we can't really afford technologies that enable work and digital life. So for instance, in the peri-urban areas in South Africa, as I've said before, there's unreliable communications infrastructure to optimally function digitally, right? Electricity is one thing, all sorts of other things. I mean, you see, let's say, Usemkanduli or Pofadar, you know, or somewhere, you see satellites, dishes and stuff, and you wonder, you know, but then we have cell phones, we have tablets, but it doesn't mean that we actually consume or really live our lives fully digitally because the internet is inaccessible, because, you know, data or broadband Wi-Fi is really expensive, right? So it becomes a social justice issue, the issue of digitizing the economy, because a lot of people are excluded because of their socioeconomic standing, but also public education, I think the minister has touched on, has only really in the last probably just over a decade been focusing on digital skills. So before that, it's as if South Africa was acting like there was no internet. And so the few who could and were interested in being online and using digital technologies, that was fine. But for the rest of the population, it doesn't really come as, you know, it's not second nature, you know, to be digital. To be online. And so, for instance, when people need to hone their digital skills, it's usually for the sake of employability, right? And so it's not something that just happens. But I'm not going to extend my time on the microphone because I was going to make an example about musicians, for instance, and how the younger generation can tap into these very opportunities that the minister was talking about, right? Because they're part of a generation that at school were given the tools to engage with the world digitally. Yes. Except there's a whole swathe of musicians who cannot do that, who've been performing on instruments, right? Traditionally performing. What do we say about those people? People who have choirs in Mossel Bay. What do we say about those people? How do they effectively become part of this digitized economy?
Yep. The Stratamia band.
Exactly.
In Cleveland's hostel. Prof. Nzeza, what are these challenges? We've listed some of the challenges that are facing African practitioners across the continent. But if you look at those against perhaps other similar challenges across other regions, any thoughts around perhaps how they may have, those other countries may have approached them differently, which perhaps create something unique around solutions that can be found for these challenges?
I think the challenges are quite the same, even if they are at different rhythm or at different level. The first is, it has already been mentioned, but I would emphasize it's the digital skills. Digital skills not only in the creative process, but also in the management process, because the way we market the goods and the art services is very different in the digital era, and they need to know how to tackle this issue. We know that most of the time we used to separate the creative process to the management process, but now with the new tools offered by the digital environment, it's possible to combine the both skills. So a creator should know at the same time the process, the production process, but also somehow the basic knowledge of the management process. The second challenge is related to the legal status. You know, most of them, they don't have a social recognition or a legal recognition that doesn't ease our operation, that it doesn't ease the way they work. That may be also explained by the fact that there is a general mindset where we don't understand really the nature of the work of the creative sector, the internal dynamics. So that there is something like a difficult dialogue between the private sector, the public sector, and also the civil society to work together in order to boost and to improve the work of artists. According to some example, I will pick some figures from a study on the COVID-19 CCI impact that I published 2 years ago in the Conversation Africa. We know that the informal sector is widespread in the creative sector, and according to the figures in Senegal, by example, from the available study at the time, it's 53% of level informality, while you have 80% in countries like Kenya, and 35 in South Africa, and 25% in Namibia. So the challenges are quite the same, but at different level. And the response from the government should maybe to help them to leave the informal sector and to get inside the formal sector, but also to be able to swim and to work with the informality, because the informality in the creative sector should not be considered all the time as a threat, but maybe something that can be very beneficial, and you may use it fruitfully.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I've just spotted one of the comments on Zoom around infrastructure, and that, in fact, was going to be the question I was going to throw at you, Dr. Anderson. You know, we've heard about the challenges and the opportunities and the outcome of your study. Is there a way that maybe you can just give us one view around what exactly, you know, when we say governments should look into supporting infrastructure, what would you say exactly that is? Are you able to? We've got a deputy minister. Yes, I'm talking. Sorry, I've left you for so long, and you. No, I'm talking to you. You've got a deputy minister right here next to you. Your report says to support the industry, government needs to look at doing something with regards to enabling infrastructure. What is that exactly?
Thank you. I just want to, I know I said this in other panels, but I think it needs to be reiterated, the vision and the leadership of the government of South Africa to carry on with the vision they have, and then to follow it through. So this is very, very encouraging, and the work that Saco was doing, it's also is incredible, and I think so. When we say chapeau, I take my hat off to the work that has been doing. So that is very important, and I think it will be a building on this, very important, very, very relevant. The master plan that is being put forward, I think is also something that needs to be mentioned, and I would be very, very keen to follow how the resolution of the bills goes, and happy for UNCTAD to support in anything we can, in particular particular in the capacity building projects to support the different activities or the different activities or strategies in the master plan. Today, one of the experts from Saco mentioned the vulnerability index that Saco is working on, is going to be published soon. I'm not sure if there's anybody, well, I don't see the person here, but I think it will be very, very important to see the results of that study, because that is one of the things I was saying, that it prepares you for the bad times. You know what are the sectors that are vulnerable. So these are the sectors that need to be reinforced when things are not going so well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. At this point, I would like to take some questions from the floor so that we've heard from our esteemed panel. Ooh, they are waving hands on this side. Oh, there's a waving hand. I think, yeah, I was told you can press green, even though I didn't manage to do it. I'm sure you'll be manage. And then so you can go first, and then the gentleman at the top there. Thank you. Yes. Yes, sorry, I'm looking at you through the... Maybe just speak up a bit, Johnny, because I think the mic is not on. So maybe either project a bit more, or if they can assist with the mic. No. Test. Okay, whilst we're there, maybe we'll take that question and then we'll come back to you. Oh, it looks like you're good now.
Okay, thank you. My question is to the Deputy Minister. My name is Johnny. I'm representing the American Arts Chamber of Commerce. So we bridge the gap between commerce, community, and creativity at a global level. I just want to know how South Africa leverages its advantage or privilege, especially when it comes to global platforms like the G20, BRICS, being the only African nation there. How is South Africa utilizing that privilege to advance the agenda for African culture? So when Hollywood comes to Africa, Hollywood starts in South Africa. The first Netflix original was Queen Sono, a South African production. The Lion King, South African idea, actually. South African musicians with Nigerian musicians in Black Panther, The Lion King. So South Africa is so well positioned, number one being the most industrialized economy in Africa. But it looks like you are failing to drive the African agenda, especially at these global platforms where you have, I think, an unchallenged authority to speak for the continent as a whole. So where are you dropping the ball, and how do we now, working within the continent as we foster Pan-African integration and global cooperation, rely on South Africa really to rise to the occasion? Thank you.
I'll take all three questions, dear, so that the panel can then respond all at once. So I'll take the second question, and then I'll take one from the audience online.
Thank you very much. My name is Tunderai. I work as a creative industries consultant. My question is really around the conversation around digitization. I think as we speak of digitization and that space, we speak of it as if it's a static space, as if it's what it is today is what it is going to be tomorrow, and that what it was and next week and next month. But it's an ever-evolving space. And therefore, as we debate and discuss, I'm almost worried about it, because there are new developments every day and every week and every month, every year even. Right now, I think we're talking about the metaverse. We're talking about, NFTs as art. We're talking about different kinds of things that are already happening within spaces. And so on the continent where we are, we kind of are only thinking about it, I think from a 4IR perspective, fourth industrial revolution, having access to, iPads and all that. But I think for me, it's a case of saying, we have to realize where we are and to realize that we actually are so far behind and that this space that we speak of, this digital world, is ever evolving. And therefore, there actually has to be much more speed in terms of what we do, much more commitment in terms of finances, in terms of really making sure that the technology, that we can move with the technology, that whatever technology is put up, that we're able to at least say that we have this and we're using it, particularly as creatives. And so I'm not sure whether it's a question or a comment, but I think the panel would be able to react to that, whether it's the Deputy Minister or any of the other panelists, that the digital space is ever evolving and ever moving, and without that awareness, I think we are going to be speaking about putting something online, when already there are concerts that happen online. People are launching music videos in games. People are doing multiple things. The virtual space, the metaverse. Already, this is here. And where are we when it comes to those things? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I will give all the panelists an opportunity to respond to all of the questions. I think hopefully you've made notes of those two. I've got two more questions from those that have joined us online. The first question is from Hannah Beulah from Kenyatta University in Kenya. It says, how can we cushion the creatives against duplication and exploitation that may result into a slump in digital jobs, which may in future render the economy redundant? I hope the panel got that, my esteemed panel. Which is how do we cushion creatives against duplications, which may result in certain digital jobs being redundant? Another question from our online panel, an online audience, is from Dr. Morrison Mutuku, which says, do we have adequate expertise to lead digitization initiatives in Africa? What is your take on that? I would like to start off with DM and then, whichever of those you can comment on and whatever closing remarks you may have. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think let me start with the easy one. Do we have enough expertise to push this digital that we're talking about? My answer would be yes and no. In the sense that I think Africa has got the expertise, but probably what we had not been given the opportunity is the space. What we need to do is to allow governments as well to create the space for this digital expertise to thrive. And for me, the important thing, therefore, is that in Africa, you are going to need to make sure that the soft diplomacy between African countries must thrive, must work. We should stop being selfish, that we would want to see probably one African country becoming more than the other. We need to make sure that we carry each other in the process. That's one. The second thing for me is that, look, in Africa, we had already, particularly in South Africa, what we had done, we had already popularized the month of May as the Africa Month. And what we had done, because of, we had made those programs to be digitized, to make sure that we share the expertise with our African sisters and brothers. And I think if we can make that program grow more, it can actually assist Africa, not only South Africa, it's Africa in the field of digitization. Thirdly, I think we must continue to agree that programs now must take the hybrid form, like what we are doing now. Because not all of us will be in one room, but also we must not stop those that can be in the room to be part of the process.
Yes.
Then that way, it also assists us to grow in the digitization space. So I'm saying let's then grab every opportunity that we have and make sure that in the process we grow. I hear the question that says, of course, as we talk about that, this digitization evolves. It changes every day. It means we must be agile as Africans. It means we must understand that it is not a redundant area. It is an area that every day you must learn. Every day you must be able to learn new technologies. Because if you are not going to open yourself up to learn, then you are not supposed to be in this space in the first place. That's just me. And I really want to get to the question about, is South Africa using its leverage? Because in all the spaces that it is in, my answer would be probably not enough. Not enough. We could do better, and we could do more. We are in the space of the G20. We are in the space of the BRICS. We might have done well because in the last 2 years, the African Union adopted the year 2020 as the year of arts, culture, and heritage. And we pushed for that because we wanted to make sure that the whole of the continent starts to look and think about arts, culture, and heritage as something that is critical and important. But are we utilizing the fact that we are in the space that can assist not only us, but Africa in general? I said we can do better. We are in a pole position that we can actually use those. And I think what we have done, and with the policies that we've put together as well, which is going to force us to do some of these things, the master plan and the revised policy on arts, culture, and heritage is going to force us to be able to do some of these things. But my clear-cut answer is that we have not done enough. We could do better.
Thank you very much for that, DM. I will go to Dr. Anderson and the remainder of the panel to respond and also closing comments. And if they can indulge us with wrapping it up in 2 minutes each for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So first, is South Africa in a position to compete? And South Africa, as I mentioned this morning, is the second largest exporters of creative goods in Africa. So I think South Africa is producing very interesting creative goods, but also creative services. So as the Vice Minister was saying, there is room for improvement, and you know more about that than I do. So you tell us where you think we can support. One of the things I did just before the conflict in Ukraine, I was in Ukraine doing a mapping of the value chain of the creative services. And it was interesting because the creative services in Ukraine, the markets are the West. And the creative goods, the markets are Russia. So, you know, all this painting and sculpture, all Russia, goes to Russia. The markets are Russia. The creative services are mainly the West. So they were saying, one of the things very interesting, by working on the map, on the value chains that Andy Pratt was mentioned, the ecosystem. He had a slide there where he showed the ecosystem of the music. And this is an exercise that countries can do when they identify a sector that is interesting to them. And when we were working with them, we realized that one of the key things that they have as a creative services was the cartoons. They have very popular cartoons in Ukraine that were doing really, really well. But by doing the value change, the ecosystem that Andy Pratt was mentioning, we realized that it was the scripts where they didn't have any expertise, so they were importing the scripts from the US. And so and in that, it was a break in the value change in a way, and it was such a pity. So they realized that they needed there to have education in the secondary, at the university level, on how to write the scripts. It doesn't have to be a university degree, but it can be courses that train people who like creative writing on how to write the scripts. Yes. So they put all their energy on that, and that was unfortunately before the conflict, so I couldn't, I don't know what happened with that, but I'm hoping that I will be able to come back and revert to that. So, but that's a good exercise, and I think it's a good application of what Andy Pratt was saying. Concerning how we can avoid duplication, most of the creative industries I am talking about generally are profitable, are industries. So they are competing. Duplication will come, and the ones that produce products that are liked by the consumers will get better and will get the job done. This is a very delicate industry because the consumer needs to like it. Yes. And the consumer will pay. So we are not these industries will not be eligible in a way for subsidies. They are competing, and by competing is how they are going to get their good result. There will be job losses with digital economy. We produce in UNCTAD a report. I'm not expert on that. My colleagues in the digital division are. But the interesting bit was they identified jobs that obviously will be lost. But this happened even in the industrial revolution. New jobs are created. So what the Vice Minister was saying, education is crucial.
Yes, yes,
yeah?
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Nzuta?
Okay, thank you. About duplication, basically there's nothing stopping anyone else from duplicating what you can do online at this point, depending on which country you are on the African continent and what kind of IP systems or IP protection systems exist. If you are in one of the countries where copyright is a thing that is observed, that is protected, then you're lucky. Because IP is a whole other issue on the IP continent that needs serious discussion. And then to speak to the gentleman at the top about how, for instance, the digital space is an ever-evolving area. He's absolutely spot on. Digital resources have been viewed as nice-to-haves, and governments have not been proactive about the fact that digital resources are, in fact, essential parts of modern-day economies for advancement, for innovation, and for entrepreneurship. And we're not just talking about entertainment. We're talking about a whole field of possibilities. Yes. And the onus is not really on practitioners, I think, to be digitally literate, unfortunately, because it really depends on your socioeconomic circumstances. And that means the education system should, if the government wants to reap rewards from digitization, digital resources, then it should invest in such resources for the masses. So we're talking GDP. I know this is an economic conference, but yeah, there's more to the creative sector than just industry.
Wow, more than just entertainment as well. Prof. Nzenza, coming to you for a closing comment with the 120 seconds to go.
Thank you. Zama, I will quickly comment on the question related to the fact that the digital is something evolving. We are talking about an environment that may disappear tomorrow. I think it is part of the job, it's part of the game. The digital is evolving rapidly, speedily. That is a fact, that is a challenge. And also culture is also a challenge because it is characterized most of the time by risk, uncertainty, and intangibility. And to conclude, I will take an African perspective to say that the African Union framework on CCI has been revised, and it's time to move towards an intra-African trade of cultural goods and services to make alive the free continental trade area. I think it is a challenge for everybody, and the most advanced countries like South Africa should take the lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you once again to everyone that joined in for this panel discussion. Thank you very much to my esteemed panel. Thank you to the supporters of this panel, Saco, as well as the Conversation Africa. For those that do not know, in fact, they may well be one of the key solutions to where to from here, because they keep the conversation going. They are a non-profit entity that really democratizes the engagement of news and articles that talk about the creative industries from a research point of view, but also at the same time making sure that they publish articles that are easy to read. So in that way, we bridge the gap between the very esteemed academics and all these learned people that are in the room today, as well as the practitioners, as well as every other citizen of our continent and the rest of the world, in making sure that they are informed with content that really is research-based but can make an impact into their industry. I thank you very much for your patience. Have a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings to an end the talking. We are pleased encouraging you to go onto the deck. There is a cocktail and canapes event. I saw lots of champagne glasses. Please come and interact with people from the panel and get to know people in a less serious manner. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We'll see you tomorrow morning if we don't see you at the cocktail party. Thank you.